John 10:16 says, "And I have other sheep that are not of this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice, so there will be one flock, one shepherd." This is a famous passage where Jesus is teaching his audience that he is the good shepherd. And being the good shepherd, his sheep will hear his voice. He cares for them. He lays his life down for them. This beautiful imagery that he gives them. And in verse 16, when he refers to sheep not of this fold, many members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints interpret him using that term to refer to the American peoples that he would visit after his ascension at the end of the Gospels. In fact, they get this interpretation from 3 Nephi 15 in the Book of Mormon, where Jesus tells the Nephites that they are these very people to whom he's referring in John chapter 10. But that's just not what Jesus is saying here. And the only thing you need to do to figure that out is to see what the rest of the New Testament has to say. One of the major themes throughout the entire Old and New Testament is that there are two peoples that exist: the people of God and everyone else. In fact, the New Testament identifies those groups very clearly by saying Jew and Gentile, or Jew and Greek. That is, the sons of Abraham and those who are not of God throughout the Old Testament. After Jesus' ascension, one of the most major events that takes place in church history is the Acts 15 Jerusalem Council, where we see these ideas of these two peoples come to the front. The believers at that time in Acts 15 are all Jewish in their background. And they're seeing Gentiles come to faith in mass, and they're wondering, what are we going to do with these Gentile peoples? They must have to become Jewish in order to be good Christians. That's the assumption, because they thought you had to be Jewish to honor God, particularly getting circumcised is a mark of becoming a Jew. In this council, some of the disciples and the apostles are saying what they have been observing throughout their church planting, church growing ministry, and they recount stories about how Gentiles get saved just like they were saved. The Spirit fills them just as the Spirit had filled them, and they're showing this as evidence that God is working amongst these Gentile peoples before they've been circumcised, before they've aligned their lives to any Jewish principles. The apostles even look to the Old Testament and consult the scriptures to discern what to do about this. And what they find is that even the Old Testament made it clear that God's plan was to take these two peoples and to unite them in one in Christ. The rest of the New Testament gives a similar picture. Let me show you a few places. Ephesians chapter 2 refers to the Gentiles as people who were without God and without hope in this world. So Ephesians 2, verse 12, talks about these Gentiles, the Gentile audience, these Ephesians, saying that remember that you were at that time, before you're saved, separated from Christ, alienated from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. So they were strangers and not the people of God. But then in verse 14, it says of Jesus, "For he himself is our peace, who has made us both one, and has broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility by abolishing the law of commandments expressed in ordinances, that he might create in himself one new man in place of the two, so making peace, and might reconcile us both to God in one body through the cross, thereby killing the hostility." Later in Ephesians 3, verse 6, he says, "This mystery is that the Gentiles are fellow heirs, members of the same body, and partakers of the promise in Christ Jesus through the gospel." This same author, Paul, writes in Romans chapter 11, using a very helpful illustration to make a point about the two people becoming one. He uses the illustration of an olive tree. The olive tree is representing the people of God throughout the Old Testament, rooted in Jesse. It's kind of pointing back to Jesus for us as a shadow, even in the Old Testament, pointing towards him. This true tree had many people who had been broken off, branches removed, pruned off because of unbelief. But new branches from wild olive trees, Gentiles, have been grafted into that one tree. In this way, those who had not been people of God are now joined into the true one people of God tree. The LDS idea that the other sheep in John 10 are referring exclusively to a people in the Western Hemisphere discredits the idea that the entire Bible, both Old Testament and New Testament, show us that God's plan was to take Gentiles from all over the world, all the different nations, and unite them into the one flock, the one fold of Jesus' sheep. Some Mormons, though, might point to John 10 and say, but Jesus says that they will hear his voice. So again, verse 16, Jesus says, I must bring them, those other sheep, also, and they will listen to my voice. So there will be one flock, one shepherd. And the assumption would be that, well, that means that Jesus has to speak audibly, visit personally, speak audibly to these people for them to qualify as the other sheep he's talking about here in John 10. The problem with that is that the voice of Jesus here, or word of Christ as it's used elsewhere, does not refer to Jesus' visible, actual coming to new peoples again and again and again. So go back to Romans, but now to chapter 10. This is where Paul tells all the people this is the plan that Jesus laid out for reaching the lost world. He says, starting in verse 13, for everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. How then will they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in him of whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching? And how are they to preach unless they are sent? Verse 17 then says, so faith comes from hearing, and hearing through the word of Christ. The word of Christ, the voice of Jesus, is now delivered by the disciples of Jesus. This is why in the Great Commission in Matthew chapter 28, Jesus tells his disciples to go and make disciples. He doesn't say, watch me as I go. He says, you go, and surely I will be with you to the end of the age. Jesus' plan for global evangelism is not multiple subsequent Christ visits, but it's the preaching of the gospel by his disciples. So the plan for kingdom building is not that Jesus would go to the other sheep, but that he would send us to the other sheep. This is why true disciples of Christ today go to those other sheep, that they may hear the word of Christ, believe, and be saved.